Since Henry Ford, we've assumed that we can decompose work into small bits, and by adding those small bits all up together, it will end up with the whole system that we were hoping to achieve. I posit that this is not the case, and that, in fact, by decomposing work, we're creating organizational dysfunction, which eventually leads to scandalous products. I'll talk about that a bit here in this lecture. I love this story, and I don't think anything describes my teaching any better than this story known as The Blind Men and the Elephant. It's at least 3,000 years old and shows up in many religious traditions, including Hindu, Jain, Sufi, Buddhism, and on and on. You would think by this point we might have learned our lesson, but no, to be honest with you, we haven't. It's the story of a group of blind men who have never before come across an elephant and try to understand what it is by touching it. Each blind man feels a different part of the elephant, but only one part, such as its side, its tail, or its tusk. When they describe it based on their personal experience, their descriptions are very different, and in some renditions of the story, they accuse the others of lying, and they even come to blows. The moral is that humans tend to claim absolute truth based on their limited subjective experience, and they discount the experiences of others. Our systems engineering methods, which are based on decomposing problems into small parts, where individuals focus on only their own responsibilities, is analogous to the blind man problem. Requirements, design, testing, manufacturing, service, disposal, etc., each operate in their own silos, with too little interaction in between. Over a decade ago, DARPA highlighted decomposition as a concern in the design of aerospace and defense products. They noted that system requirements are decomposed based on arbitrary cleavage lines, much as the blind men didn't understand that the other portions of the elephant existed. Detailed design occurs within stovepipes. Undesired interactions lead to emergent behaviors during integration. Conventional verification and validation techniques do not scale, and result in architectures which are fragile point designs. There are many examples of this, and this case of a fragile design occurred at General Motors. It is known as the ignition switch scandal, but even that fits the blind men analogy. What first set me on this was not GM, but my many other clients facing similar dilemmas and choosing the same path. In fact, I was consulting inside the offices of a very well-known company as the GM CEO apologized to Congress for her company's poor change management practices. And yet this client with whom I was working chose to follow those same failed practices, even when we highlighted the similarities. GM followed the V model method when designing a new automobile, but still the vehicle's airbag system did not protect occupants when they needed it most. This led to over 120 deaths and $8 billion in losses. The legal investigation found that GM sold cars in which the spring tension of the ignition switch failed to meet the company's own specifications. And it also became clear that 2 years after the start of production, the engineer responsible for the switch made a production change without following customary change management practices. And literally the same week as GM CEO was testifying about this organizational failure, the engineers at my client firm chose to follow those same failed practices. In short, the engineering culture at my client feared its own CEO. So I decided that week that we would discuss the ignition switch in my class, and we've done it ever since it first made the news in 2014. I flew home on Friday and said we're going to talk about this on Saturday. But many of my students hold the same role as the engineer who was blamed in the legal report, and while they rightly fault him for making an unethical decision, over the years they have added context into what I teach about the product development process. In this case, we read that a new government regulation had been created to reduce unintended airbag deployments, such as a child playing in a parked car. We see that a software team implemented this requirement by only powering the airbag circuitry when the ignition switch was in the run position. But knowledge of the decision remained siloed within their group. At the time, the switch engineer who eventually made the unethical decision was consumed by problems in an unrelated set of electronics as he tried to prepare the switch for production. But very late in his development process, so late that it would delay the launch and cost GM millions of dollars in lost revenue, the engineer learned that the switch was not holding tension. The engineer was faced with a decision to delay the product launch by months for a problem which seemed entirely unrelated to safety. he made the expedient, if unethical, decision to allow the switch to proceed to production, and then he would watch for future warranty problems. He even purchased one of the vehicles for his son. But 2 years later, the switch was causing a different set of problems, and when the engineer attempted to follow the change management process, he was stymied by an engineering culture which needed either a safety or economic justification to allow for a change. And still no one knew that this was a safety concern. Stymied by the change process, the engineer quietly changed how the supplier manufactured the physical switch without following the change management procedure. My point in this somewhat long story is that culture eats the V model for breakfast. Requirements management will never be enough. We must also account for cultural dynamics. In the GM ignition switch, the new government requirement was developed in 1997, and the fateful decisions made by both the electronics and the ignition switch teams were made between 1998 and 2002. A few years after this, in 2008, the book A Practical Guide to SysML was published, and in the chapter titled SysML Lite, it creates a set of models based on an air compressor, as shown in this diagram. And this diagram on the left was developed by students in my class when studying the switch. Looking at the two diagrams, it is not a stretch to say that if GM had been making use of the SysML methodologies, which were developed a decade later, it would have been possible to find the information needed to avoid the issue from the beginning. GM issued other recalls during this time frame, and I feel confident in saying that if the organization could have recognized the systemic connections between these two boxes as the decisions were being made, no lives would have been lost. I mentioned that I first began teaching the ignition switch in 2014. 5 years later, in 2019, the class was investigating the switch when the second Boeing 737 MAX went down. In this case, it was operated by Ethiopian Air. I spent the next few months after the semester was over researching what occurred in that first crash. There's just better information available in a plane operated by Lion Air, and the preceding steps that had been implemented by Boeing before the crash occurred. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, a Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, lost control and crashed into the sea. A few minutes before it crashed, the first officer was given control of the aircraft, but in training, the officer did not show good air handling skills. He was handed control by the pilot, who had been fighting the controls for the previous few minutes and needed a little time to think through the problems he was having. The day prior, in a previous flight on the same aircraft, another pilot had to fight through similar problems, including a stick shaker warning, and flight safety rules indicate that the pilot should have returned to his departure airport. However, the plane flew on to its destination, and the pilot did not even report the stick shaker event to the maintenance crews. And just prior to this flight, a maintenance technician replaced the angle of attack indicator, but failed to properly calibrate it. The indicator hence gave a false indication that a level aircraft was about to stall. And 1 year prior to this, the angle of attack sensor was refurbished at a supplier facility in Florida and calibrated on a machine which had a switch set in the wrong position. The miscalibrated sensor sat in inventory for a year, waiting to be used. So now let me kind of push the V over there, and we're going to talk about what happened at Boeing. In 2011, Boeing lost a large order which they had expected to sell to American Airlines. This created a business need for a modification to the 737 model to reduce the use of fuel, but require no pilot retraining. Designers chose a larger engine, but being larger, it needed to be placed further forward on the wings. And this might cause a rare instability through changing the flight dynamics. The following year, the new model's first test pilot was asked to allow for a piece of software-controlled autonomy called the MCAS to address this occasional instability. He resisted the request but was eventually convinced by the engineers to include it only in rare occurrences which were triggered by both a high angle of attack and a high acceleration turn. He felt that most pilots would never see this in their careers. 4 years later, it's now January of 2016, that original test pilot had retired and the new test pilot advocated for increased use of the MCAS in normal flight. It was now enabled based strictly on the angle of attack without the need for high acceleration. Engineers in the meeting described this as a thoroughly run-of-the-mill decision that generated little or no debate. By November 2016, and just 5 months prior to its planned product launch, which is an FAA certification, a third test pilot responsible for defining pilot training is seeing strange behavior. This pilot had previously lobbied the FAA to remove mention of the MCAS from the flight manual. Removing it from the manual also removed the need to train pilots in what to do if the MCAS failed. Thus, no pilots were trained in how to manage an MCAS failure. In fact, they were not even aware of the existence of this piece of automation, which could take control of the aircraft away from them, as happened in both the Lion Air and the Ethiopian Air crashes. In October of 2021, this third test pilot was indicted for fraud by fraudulently withholding evidence from the FAA, but he was acquitted. I want to move on to systems thinking, and while I have a master's, a doctorate, and a faculty position in systems engineering, to be honest, I'm not sure what the term means. Notably, in the entirety of the product lifecycle, engineering is a subsystem. The foundation of much of my current work can be found in this book, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. The concept is that systems follow feedback loops, which are either reinforcing or balancing. In a reinforcing loop, growth encourages more growth. The traditional symbol is an avalanche, in which a small disturbance at the top is continually reinforced until the snowfall eventually wipes out the ski chalets at the bottom of the mountain. In a balancing feedback loop, growth discourages growth. An example is in gasoline prices. As the price rises, the number of vehicle miles traveled will drop. Note then that my minimal definition of systems thinking includes feedback loops and also organizational dynamics. These are topics which are not generally discussed in systems engineering. The loops work well in describing systems when you combine them into archetypes, and this is one known as a limits to growth model. For example, at some point in the Middle Ages, farming communities organized so that one family devoted their attention to plowing the fields of everyone else, and the other families shared their bounty with the family of the oxen team. This led to more food and reinforcing growth of the community. By the 20th century, oxen were replaced by tractors such as those seen here. More food could be harvested by fewer people and transported further distances. The agricultural economy shifted to an industrial economy known as the Second Industrial Revolution. But this reinforcement is reaching its limits, meaning that human growth is balanced by nature. The space available for automobiles has become limited, and carbon emissions impact the climate. The global supply chain has grown such that human populations are growing into viral reservoirs, which are flown easily around the world, causing pandemics, as we saw with COVID-19. And this is another archetype known as shifting the burden. In it, you can see that there is some problematic symptom and two possible solutions. One addresses the obvious symptoms with lower cost, immediate payback, and seemingly positive results. A fundamental solution may exist, but it is difficult to address because it is costly and time-consuming, and the other solution seems to be working so well. But eventually a side effect appears, leading to a systemic collapse, and the collapse itself is reinforcing. As one element collapses, two which depend on it also collapse, followed by 4 and by 8, etc. This leads me to question whether our incentive structures bring societal value. A global supply chain created both lower costs in developed countries and higher economic output throughout the world. But as we saw in 2020, and we're still seeing ramifications today, a more fundamental solution would be to localize manufacturing. And I will leave you with this thought that I discuss in other lectures. Can we use digital twins to trade in virtual products to be manufactured locally rather than physical products to be shipped globally? We can see a shifting of burden in the Boeing 737 MAX. To get higher fuel efficiency with a shortened certification time, the company chose to modify an existing model. This created a burden for the new plane's aerodynamics. Fuel efficiency required larger engines and forced the wings to move forward. A seeming advantage in using the 737 was that it would require no pilot retraining, and Boeing assured airlines that the manufacturer would pay for training if it was needed. This burden shifted onto a Boeing test pilot who approved a small piece of autonomy called the MCAS for very rare circumstances. But a few years later, a different group of pilots and engineers expanded that autonomy to include many common events. Finally, a third test pilot did not raise warning flags in the very late stages of product development. These choices shifted the burden onto ground crews and pilots of airlines who didn't fully understand the ramifications of their own actions. This led to 2 crashes, a years-long grounding of the entire fleet, and eventually a return to the fundamental solution of having to retrain 737 MAX pilots. Let's circle back to the limits to growth archetype. This is a moving graph of Moore's law indicating the number of transistors per chip over the last 40 years. These charts are called hockey stick graphs due to their shape. Reinforcing growth leads to hockey stick graphs, as each new chip increases both manufacturability and demand for even more chips. This then is the share price of TSMC, one of the world's largest chip makers. I will use their share price as a rough indicator of the total number of transistors being produced in the world over the past quarter century. From 2000 to 2020, TSMC's share price is also a hockey stick graph. But note what has happened over the past 3 years since the onset of COVID. Share prices fell, as in the space of 18 months, the world went from quote-unquote an alarming shortage of chips to a major glut. For over 20 years, TSMC saw reinforcing growth, but over the past 36 months, it has entered a balancing loop. So let me leave you with a hypothetical. If the growth in the number of lines of code is roughly proportional to the number of transistors in the world, is there a limit to growth in the number of safe and effective lines of software used to operate an automobile? When will the limit be reached, and will we recognize the limit when it is? To manage complexity, we must adopt systems thinking into our mental models. As simple products grow to become complicated, we decompose tasks into thousands or millions of simple subsystems and assume that the sum of tasks will add linearly to the expected result. And this is the premise of the systems engineering tools as we focus on helping individuals master their decomposed tasks. And there's a legitimate argument that SysML would have alleviated the GM ignition switch scandal. But we must see systemically complex products as existing along another dimension, one that recognizes the impact of the very human systems responsible for product life cycles. This is the realm of systems thinking, including the feedback models shown here, and some points I haven't discussed, which are mental models, team learning, and a shared vision. These, with personal mastery, are the building blocks of systems thinking. Organizations managed through the cascade of individual performance goals might address complicatedness, but they will struggle with complexity. Decomposition techniques have reached their limit to growth. To develop stable, complex systems which bring societal value, your organization must also develop systems thinking, and this will in turn lead to agility. So let's go back to our classic system V and note that there is a simultaneous V which impacts the organization, namely the transition from negative revenue during the development phase to positive revenue after launch. The organization is revenue negative until verification and validation are complete. But when products become scandals, it is often years after the launch and revenue turns deeply negative. In the resulting legal investigations, we often find an ethical dilemma and a developer who chose a timely product launch over product safety. The complexities which lead to scandal are often due to a lack of shared vision between the two Vs. Developers who are testing against a set of requirements, and the financial organization which is pursuing positive revenue. Both are needed, but what if they conflict? This becomes worse as we see reinforcing growth in the availability of autonomous products. The burden of operating the ship, the plane, or the automobile is placed on product developers such as yourselves, rather than the ship's captain, the aircraft pilot, or the car's driver. As seen at GM, Boeing, and others, it is these product developers who face criminal prosecution. And this mess on the left has no choice but to become a limit to growth in the systemic complexity that organizations can realistically develop. And this leads me to another hypothetical. If the value prop of autonomous vehicles is that they are safer than human drivers, what if one AV manufacturer is safer than all of the others? If we assume that the safety of pedestrians is a public good, should only the safest AV manufacturer be allowed to operate? If the goal is to maximize safety, is it enough to be safer than human drivers, or do you need to also be safer than everyone else in the AV market? Should there be competition over the AV technology which kills fewer people than the other technologies? In this case, there can only be one AV winner. Or should pedestrian safety be a regulated standard above which all AV manufacturers need to achieve? I first developed this slide for a conference lecture in November of 2021, and I was concerned at that time about autonomous vehicles. In fact, if you look at the GM Cruise, some of my concerns are now playing out 2 years later. A GM press release in October of 2021 projected that the Cruise division would generate $30 billion in annual earnings by 2030. But 2 years later, in November 2023, as I record this, the division has had $4 billion in expenses without generating any appreciable revenue. In this perspective, what is the ethical pressure being placed on developers, and in particular on quality managers, to bring a revenue-generating product to market? As I record this, Cruise is laying off employees, and as a side note, 1 year ago, in October 2022, its competitor, Argo AI, shut down entirely when Ford, its largest shareholder, disbanded the company. In this environment, we must imagine a great deal of pressure on product developers to allow the company to generate revenue. Do individual ethics and a commitment to safety hold up under that pressure? Let me wrap up, as I always try to do, with a what, a so what, and a now what. Decomposing tasks, as seen in most systems engineering approaches, does not address, and it often creates, organizational dysfunction. Scandalous products have their origins in dysfunctional organizations. Systems engineering methods are necessary, but they are not sufficient. We must also adopt systems thinking. Collective learning is key. We must focus on learning from each other across the entirety of the product lifecycle. And let me leave you with one last hypothetical. Is it possible for humans to create a system which is beyond our own ability to understand? If so, what is the likely result? And what will eventually limit the growth of complexity? For more pithy comments like these, much of my course content can be found on my website at patrickhilberg.com, particularly if you follow the circles as I show there. Thank you much.